It's time to have a look at the main line after b4 c takes b4. The main line starts with the third move a3. Now if we take on a3, white will get a huge lead in development and it would be dangerous. So instead I suggest to play d5 immediately. Now we are threatening to take on e4. If white now takes on b4, we can capture on e4, and it's hard for white to regain the pawn on e4. For example, after knight c3 we play knight f6, and our next move will be e5, which will unleash the bishop and threaten the b4 pawn. This means that a takes b4 is not a problem, and white could also play e5. But here we can transpose to positions we already know. With knight c6, after d4 we play queen to b6, and we transpose to a line we have seen after the third move d4. Instead, after knight f3, we play bishop g4, and this transposes to a line we have seen after third move knight f3. So the most critical try after d5 is to take the pawn on d5. Now we recapture with the queen, and we have a threat of playing queen to e5 with check and picking up the rook on a1. So usually white plays one of two moves. He either plays knight f3 or bishop to b2 to cover the square e5 and parry the threat of queen e5. But he has also other moves. For example, the move a takes b4 was played several times, even on master level, and the games all ended with queen e5 check, which won the rook for black. After queen takes d5 also d4 was tried. Now queen e5 check is not possible anymore, and we should play quickly against the d4 pawn with knight c6. White will most likely defend the pawn on d4 with knight f3. And now white is intending to play c4 followed by d5. If we take on c3, white will recapture with a knight and then play d5. So in this position we have to act quickly and play e5. We are threatening the pawn on d4, so the most logical way for white to respond is d takes e5, taking the pawn. Now we exchange queens on d1, and white has to lose his castling right, recapture on d1. Here we play bishop to g4. The idea is to capture on e5 and use the spin on the king. Also, castle long is an option. Furthermore, white's pawns are all a little bit weakened and isolated, while black's pawn structure on the queen and on the king side is completely intact. So this position should be favorable for black. Now let's return to the position after queen takes d5 and cover the move knight f3. After this move, white's intending to take on b4 and then play knight c3, hitting the queen on d5. I suggest to play e5 in this position. The idea is to protect the pawn on b4, and after a takes b4 we can recapture with a bishop. If white now plays knight c3, hitting the queen on d5, we can simply take on c3. So let's look at the options white has in this position. He can either play bishop a3, knight a3, yes, even rook a3 is a possibility. Beside that, he can play the move c3 with the idea to play d4 later on. Let's start with bishop a3. Now white is threatening to take on b4, so we start by taking on a3 ourselves. White has two options to recapture the bishop, either with a knight or with the rook. After knight takes a3, white wants to play knight to b5 and then knight to c7. Here I suggest to play knight c6, so we can answer knight to b5 with queen to d8, protecting the c7 square, and black can continue with moves like knight f6 or knight e7 followed by castling short. In this case, white is down a pawn and he still has to prove that he has compensation for it, or that he somehow regains his pawn. Which means knight takes a3 is not a problem, and instead white can also play rook takes a3. After this move, white wants to play knight to c3 and then knight to b5, while the rook can swing on the third rank. Again, we should play knight c6, protecting the pawn on e5, and meet knight c3 with queen to d6. Don't play queen to d8 in this position, because white could play bishop to b5, pinning the knight on c6, and then threatening to take on e5 with his knight. So instead, queen to d6 is forcing white's hand, because we are immediately threatening the rook on a3. White will most likely play knight b5, attacking the queen and also protecting the rook, and we will place our queen on e7, covering the square c7 and d6, and our future plan is to play knight to f6 and castle short, while it's not completely obvious how white will regain his pawn. So let's return to bishop takes b4 and look at the very daring move rook a3. The idea of this move is that if black should take on a3, after bishop takes a3, bishop takes a3, white takes control over the dark squares, and he will play quickly knight to c3, hitting the queen, and then knight to b5, eventually going to d6. This idea was first introduced by David Bronstein in a match with the computer Deep Thought 2 in 1992. And as we could see, white is getting a lot of compensation if we take the rook. But instead, I suggest we play knight to f6 in this position. And the idea is to castle quickly. White can, for example, continue with a move like rook to e3, threatening to take on e5, and we can play knight c6. We are protecting the pawn on e5, and on the next move we can castle short. Again, white's compensation for the pawn is not completely obvious. Returning to bishop takes b4, white can also try to play the move knight to a3. White is immediately aiming for the knight b5, knight c7 idea. And as a rule of thumb, when white goes for the knight a3, knight b5, knight c7 idea, we should answer with a quick knight f6 and castling short. Usually this includes the sacrifice of a rook. So the move I suggest to play is knight f6. If we instead play knight to c6 in this position, then white's idea would work, because he can play knight to b5, threatening to go knight c7 check, so we would have to retreat with the queen to cover that square, and then white can play c3. And after the retreat of the bishop, white can play d4 and follow it up with d5. So let's play the knight f6 idea, and white has two options. He can either play with c3 followed by d4 later on, or he can play with knight b5 immediately. On knight b5, we should not waste time protecting c7 and instead castle immediately. Now white of course has to play knight c7, otherwise if he waits one move we could play knight c6, and on knight c7 we could always throw in the check on e4 and then go rook b8, so he has to go knight c7 in this position now. We go queen c5, we are attacking the knight on c7, so white is forced to take the rook on a8. Now we play e4. While the knight on a8 is trapped, we are immediately threatening the knight on f3. And white has two options. He can either go to g1 or to h4. After knight h4, we play knight g4. We are threatening queen takes f2, mate in one move. So white can only play queen to e2, protecting that mate. We play knight c6, threatening to play knight d4, hitting the queen and the pawn on c2. So the most logical way for white to reply to this is to play c3. Here we can go knight e5, with the devastating threat of going knight d3 check and then knight takes f2. And this is very hard to parry for white. If he, for example, goes c takes b4 in this position, we can still go knight d3 check. If the queen now takes on d3, we can first take on f2 with check, and then take the queen on d3. And if he goes king d1 in this position, we can take on f2 with our knight from g4, and we are winning the queen. This means that knight h4 is not a good move, and instead after h4, white should most likely play knight g1. Again, we play knight g4. We are threatening to checkmate white on f2. And again, queen e2 is answered with the idea of knight c6, threatening knight d4. And if white plays c3, we go knight e5. So here we see the difference why the knight on g1 is better than on h4, because white can play the move knight h3. Now we can keep the initiative by playing e3, and we are threatening to take on f2, while white cannot recapture on e3. If he captures on e3, we can take with a knight, hitting the queen and the c2 pawn. So the best defense for white is to play bishop e2, giving white the square f1 if we take on f2, which means that white can answer e takes f2 check with king f1. So instead we should now take on d2 with check. White is forced to recapture on d2, and we can play rook d8. We are exploiting the pin on the d file, and white is forced to give back some material. For example, if white plays bishop d3 here, we can play queen to e5 check. White cannot block with the queen because of queen takes a1, so he has to play king to f1, and then we capture on d2. And white cannot capture on d2 because of queen takes a1. Yes, in this position, white still has the rook against the bishop and the pawn, but his pieces are all misplaced, and it's very likely that he will lose the knight on a8 after moves like knight c6 and bishop to e6, which means that black should be close to winning. Instead of knight b5 immediately, white could also try another idea after knight f6. White could try to play c3 here. And the idea is to drive back the bishop, then go knight b5 and go for d4. But here black has a trick. He can play bishop c5, baiting white into playing knight b5, and now he can castle. It turns out that after knight c7, black has the move bishop takes f2 check. The idea is king takes f2, queen to c5 check. And with this double attack, black wins back his material and remains up 2 pawns. This means that the quick knight a3 is not very threatening for black, and white can play the tricky move c3 first, trying to combine the knight a3, knight b5 idea with the d4 idea. If we now go bishop to c5, hoping for the same trick with knight a3, knight f6, knight b5, castle short, knight c7 and bishop takes f2, white can instead play the move d4 after bishop to c5. So I suggest not to play bishop c5 in this position, but instead go with e4. The forcing line c takes b4, e takes f3, threatening to take on g2 and also queen to e4 check, so white has to recapture. Queen takes f3, queen takes f3, g takes f3 and knight to e7. Doesn't promise white anything. Yes, white has the bishop pair, but if you look at white's pawn structure, you see that basically every pawn is either doubled or at least isolated, while black's pawn structure is completely intact, which means that black should be better in this position. And the other move after e4 is knight to d4. But in this case, we can retreat with a bishop to c5, because white is not able to play d4 anymore. White again can go for the knight a3, knight b5 idea, but this time we can play knight f6 and allow knight b5, and since there is no attack on the e5 pawn, because we have moved it to e4, we can play the move queen to d8 and cover the c7 square. Next we will most likely castle short, maybe play a6, maybe go knight c6, and black's position is absolutely fine. He's basically up a pawn for no compensation. Now let's return to the position after e5. Beside a takes b4, white has also got the move c4 in this position. The idea is, if we take on c3, white will recapture with the knight on c3 and hit our queen on d5. That's why I suggest not to take on c3 and instead move the queen. We have several possibilities here. We can go to c5 or to d6, but then white will capture on b4, and if we capture on b4, white will capture e5. So queen c5 and queen d6 are both not strong. while on queen to d7 or queen to c6, white will immediately capture the pawn on e5 and hit the queen, so queen c6 and queen d7 are also not working. This leaves only 4 squares, e4, e6, d8 or a5. On a5, white will play bishop b2 and then capture on b4, which will result in an attack on the queen, and therefore black will have to move the queen again. So queen a5 isn't a good move. On queen to e4, white will block with a bishop, bishop e2, then castle short and play rook e1. It will turn out that the queen isn't well placed in the e-file because she is lined up with the king. This leaves 2 squares, e6 or d8. Let's have a look at queen to e6. After this move, white will play bishop to d3, intending to castle quickly and then play rook e1, rook takes e5. Here we have a problem. We cannot play e4 and win material, because if we do, white will castle. Now if we capture on d3 or on f3, white will play rook e1, winning the queen. But black has a tactical trick here, queen to f6, attacking 3 pieces at the time, rook a1, bishop d3 and knight f3. After rook e1 or bishop takes e4, which would be a transposition, queen takes a1, bishop takes e4, threatening the discovery attack, bishop takes b7 check. So we have to block the e-file with a move like bishop to e7. White will play queen to b3, threatening to play bishop to b2. And after we drop back with the queen, white captures on b4. In this position, even though black is up a full rook, the engine gives only a slight advantage for black. The reason is that white will play quickly knight c3, knight d5 and also bishop to b2, when all of his pieces will be working together, and black will not have an easy time getting his king out of the center. That's why I don't think that queen e6 is reliable, and instead I suggest to play the move queen to d8 after c4. Here white is still down a pawn and he has several options. For example, he cannot recapture his pawn with knight takes e5 because of the double attack queen d4, hitting a rook on a1 and the knight on e5. And if white tries to go for a discovery attack with, for example, queen to e2, we can still just capture the rook on a1 and knight g6 check doesn't do much damage because we can block with a bishop. After knight takes h8, we take on b1 and we are completely winning. So knight takes e5 isn't a problem. And instead, after queen to d8, white could also capture on b4. After this move, I suggest we recapture on b4, and white has 2 possibilities here. He can either take on e5 or he can throw in the check on a4. If he throws in the check on a4, we can block with a knight, protecting the bishop on b4, and white is unable to take on e5, because if he does so, we play queen to e7, pinning the knight, and no matter how white defends it, either with bishop to b2 or with f4, in both cases we can just play f6 and win the knight on e5. So queen a4 check doesn't get white anywhere, and instead, after bishop takes b4, white can play knight takes e5. In this situation, queen to d4 doesn't win a piece for black, because white can throw in the check queen a4, protecting the rook on a1 and also giving white time to move the knight. So instead of queen to d4, black should play queen to e7, pinning the knight on e5. Now white needs to defend the knight on e5 and break the pin to avoid any f6 ideas. And here I suggest to develop simply with knight f6. Black will castle short, play bishop e6, and then maybe go knight c6 or knight to d7 with a very pleasant position, while the queen on e2 is a bit misplaced because she blocks in the bishop from f1. Let's look at another option white has after queen to d8. Instead of taking on b4 or on e5, white could play bishop b2. Here I suggest to play the move e4. We are saving our e-pawn, we are hitting the knight on f3, and white has 2 options. He can either move the knight to e5 or he can play queen to e2, pinning the pawn on e4. Let's look at queen to e2 first. White pins the pawn on e4 and he's intending to capture it with queen takes e4. So we play knight f6, protecting the pawn. If white now wants to win the pawn on e4 with a move like bishop takes f6, we just recapture on f6 and we get the bishop pair, which means this is not a problem for black, and instead white will most likely play knight g5 in order to capture on e4 with his knight. We play bishop to e7, and our idea is to castle quickly. After knight takes e4 we castle, and our next move will be either rook to e8 or knight to c6, while the whole setup white has chosen here isn't working very well, because the queen on e2 is blocking in the bishop on f1 and white lags behind in development. So queen e2 and winning the pawn on e4 isn't a good idea. Instead, after e4, white could also play the move knight to e5. But now white doesn't have an attack against the e4 pawn, and instead he's threatening to take on b4. Because if we then recapture on b4, white will win the bishop with queen to a4 check, since knight to c6 can be easily answered with knight takes c6, getting rid of the defender of the b4 bishop. This means that we have to take on a3 first before we continue our development. So we take on a3. After knight takes a3, we play knight f6, and our future setup includes bishop to e7, castling short, and getting rid of the knight on e5 with moves like knight c6 or knight to d7. Black is up a pawn in this situation, and I'm not sure white has enough compensation for it. This covers the sixth move c4, and after e5 there's only one more line white can try, which is bishop to b2. After knight c6 we have a transposition to the main line, which we will discuss next. This concludes the analysis on the fifth move, knight to f3.